Camp Bastion is a strange place. It's in the middle of nowhere, really. It's impossible to find it on maps. It's deliberately not next to any major settlement, incredibly well defended, a kind of bleak, windswept square of land in the middle of a desert. Camp Bastion has the main field hospital. It's basically the place where they can perform quite sophisticated medical treatments very close to the front lines. But it's actually a staging post. All British soldiers that are travelling forward to these points of contact in the front line will have to arrive at Camp Bastion. This is an operating theatre where potentially brain surgeons, orthopaedic surgeons and others will be dealing with casualties which are arriving at 40 minutes' notice. It very quickly becomes the site of incredibly dramatic, incredibly highly skilled activity. But looking at it, it looks like a tent which is covered in dust in a fairly primitive context. To bring soldiers back from the places where the conflict is still commencing, there's something called MERT, a Medical Emergency Response Team, and they fly forward in Chinook helicopters, accompanied by Apaches, and attempt to try and pull the soldier back as fast as possible. What we're seeing in these explosions is actually the collection of vast amounts of waste ammunition which has been buried near the edge of the perimeter of Camp Bastion, or material which has been brought in by soldiers. And once every week there is a massive explosion to clear this dangerous ordnance at the edge of the perimeter. I was told when I got there that within 10 days I'd be institutionalised. I doubted it at the time because the environment I'd arrived in was so foreign to me. But it is interesting that within a very short time you feel part of a community. My internal prejudice of assuming that the community that I was going to be part of was going to be entirely separate from me was actually far more diverse. As a young soldier had been a victim of a mine strike. It was the first time I'd actually seen somebody arriving with serious injury, and I'd expected them to be screaming or somehow for the whole thing to be dramatic and chaotic. And what it was this kind of sense of disbelief and bewilderment. He was obviously partially sedated, but still awake enough to understand what had happened to him. Civilians would sometimes get caught between insurgents or Taliban and British or other nations. What I saw was the Chinook helicopters bringing back not only British but also suspected Taliban and innocent civilians caught in the middle of this. I understood it was shrapnel wounds that caused the injuries for the children. Civilians remained on the wards until they were seen as safe enough to return back to their villages or homes in a way that they would be able to continue treating themselves or getting healthcare from the limited local resources available. The amazing thing really is that as you travel to the front line and you realise that the proximity of the war is measured in yards rather than miles, that you can look out over the sandbags and begin to catch a glimpse of the country which this conflict is part of. We see the beauty, the sublime beauty of the landscape of Afghanistan from these remote posts. Young soldiers, 20-year-olds, would spend hours staring out across a wonderfully beautiful and complex landscape, probably from behind a gun, and probably staring out, not looking necessarily at the way in which the light was falling across the mountains, but at the possibility of threats appearing in the shadows. What I decided was that I could never be an objective voice, but it was valuable to have an additional subjective view. And for the medics and the nurses and the patients, they felt it was very important that some additional record was kept. This was an area which they felt at the time was largely hidden from the public.